This is the Ultrarunning History Podcast. I'm your host, Davey Crockett. Thanks for coming. This is episode 174. In this episode, I will continue telling the story of Old Sport Campana, the most popular ultrarunner of the 19th century, the clown of the pedestrian era. This is part 7 in this series and previews chapter 9 of my new book, Old Sport Campana, available on Amazon. YouTube has been investing more into podcasting and is now a popular platform to listen and watch podcasts. This podcast is available on YouTube with lots of photos in the Ultrarunning History YouTube channel. I have also started to publish many short videos, 2 to 3 minutes long, about legendary ultrarunners. Check them out and please subscribe to the Ultrarunning History YouTube channel. Also check out a second YouTube channel I've created, the Grand Canyon History channel, with lots of history to enhance your running adventures in the Grand Canyon. In 1889, Old Sport Campana returned home to Bridgeport, Connecticut after his 4-month trip to California. His celebrity status had increased because of news stories across the country about how he beat up the unscrupulous race manager Frank Hall. During his 10-year ultrarunning career thus far, he had competed in at least 41 races, including 24 6-day races. As he did each summer, Campana took time away from racing, but frequently made appearances at local sporting events including foot races. Campana published a boxing challenge to the world. I, Napoleon Campana, alias Old Sport, hereby challenge any man in the world 61 years of age to fight to a finish for the sum of $500 aside. If this challenge is not accepted, I claim for myself the title of Champion of the World. No one took up the wager, so he must have become the champion boxer of the world. He next issued a challenge to race any man over 60 years in a 100-mile race. Campana was actually 52 years old. It would not have been a fair race. In September 1889, Campana announced that he was in training for his, quote, farewell race in America, a 6-day, 12 hours per day race to be held in the Polo Rink in New Haven, Connecticut. Would it really be the last race of his career? He was asked how he made a living. He replied, I don't work for a living, young feller. He demanded $250 from the race manager to start the race, but was refused. He left the rink in disgust. Campana returned later as a spectator and sent a gift to his Connecticut rival, Alfred Elson, who was in the race and was the same age as Campana. It was a cabbage with $5 rolled inside it.
Elson declined to carry the cabbage around the rink, so Sport stuck it on the end of a board and dogged him around the track, holding the cabbage over Elson's head.
In October 1889, Campana was hired to sell peanuts at the Danbury, Connecticut Fair by Orrin Bronson. Sales went well. Bronson claimed that Campana skipped out of town with all the money and intended to have him arrested if he could find him. Campana was a sly businessman, where the saying, buyer beware, really meant something. In early January 1890, he dropped into a Bridgeport saloon and exhibited his fruit for sale. He sold 50 lemons.
While he counted the fruit and placed it in a basket belonging to the purchaser, the old man kept up a rambling talk about his races in the past. He kept his tongue moving at a lively rate until he had counted out 50 lemons. He then received his money with a smile and a God bless you, mister, and left the place singing a popular song.
Later in the day, the buyer, the bartender, removed a paper wrapping one of the pieces of fruit and discovered that it was an apple instead of a lemon. Nearly all the fruit in the basket turned out to be apples, with only about a dozen lemons. In January 1890, Campana was asked why he wasn't competing in a race in nearby Waterbury, Connecticut, He explained that the race director, Maloney, had come to recruit him for the race. He asked Campana what he wanted in return.
I told him I wanted a suit of clothes, not like the clothes he had on, but a suit to walk in. He said I could have anything I wanted and told me to meet him at the train depot on Monday.
Maloney publicized that Campana would be in the race, but he was a no-show at the train station.
Why, that Maloney wanted me to go to Waterbury and advertise his walking match. That was all he cared about. But the fellow knows now that the old man ain't no fool and won't spoil his reputation for a few dollars. Yes, mister, Old Sport is poor, but honest.
In February 1890, Campana was injured when he jumped from a moving freight train in Bridgeport and experienced a bad fall. He had been obviously using trains like a tramp to move from town to town.
To the first sympathetic group he could find, Sport expressed his indignation at the outrageous conduct of the train in failing to stop for him and also displaying the abrasions on his injured limb.
He was mostly upset at a patch of skin that had been taken off over the tattoos of his boxing heroes, including boxer John L. Sullivan. He said,
What an awful thing it would have been if I had lost my leg with the names of the 3 acknowledged champions of the world upon it. The other leg I wouldn't have cared so much about, but to have the names of the 3 champions cut off by the doctor would have broken my heart.
Campana claimed that he wanted to do business at the upcoming Chicago World's Fair that would open in 3 years in 1893. A separation from his wife was probably a major motivating factor to leave Connecticut. He began his trip west 3 years early, and on the way voluntarily spent the night locked up at the Lancaster, Pennsylvania police station because he had no money. He alleged he was abandoned by his financial backers in Philadelphia. A month later, in April 1890 in Cleveland, he was again arrested for drunkenness and confined to a brutal workhouse. While there, he caught his hand in a machine and lost 2.5 fingers. The workhouse had a reputation of being the most brutal around. After a year away from competing in an ultra-distance race, he arrived in Chicago, Illinois, and started in a 25-hour race held at the 2nd Regiment Armory.
Campana was a familiar figure. He looked like an Egyptian mummy with a bald head and a plush nose, and he wore a suit of red underwear. He had a placard on his breast for a chest protector, on which was lettered, Old Sport Campana, the Apollo Belvedere of sawdust.
He proclaimed he would win or die on the track. He started out fast, as usual, but slowed down in the evening into 19th place.
The Old Sport really made a spurt during the evening. Somebody gave him a bunch of flowers, and the old man girded up his loins and ran a lap or two nearly as fast as the best of them. Then the old man went back to sleepwalking.
Campana, with, quote, tattered autographs of friends on his calves, finished in 2nd place, 10 miles behind the winner, Tom Cox, with 271 miles. Campana had only slept 3 hours during the race. The event was poorly attended and lost money.
Campana's share of the gate receipts will not be enough to enable him to retire, and he will continue to sell chewing gum at so much per chew.
In August 1890, he was spotted still in Chicago, training with George Connor of England, who was living in New York City. Detroit was the epicenter for several 6-day races in 1890. Campana went to Detroit to compete. The day before the race, the runners paraded through the city, led by the Detroit Military Band, to much fanfare. They were dressed in, quote, natty dusters and hats and carried canes. On Labor Day 1890, 27 runners came out onto the track right after midnight, each wearing a certain color to help the spectators learn their names. Campana was dressed in all colors of the rainbow. The starter yelled, "Boys, are you ready? Then go!" Campana reached 100 miles during the first 24 hours, tied for 11th place.
He covers ground remarkably well, considering his age and the fantastic garb he wears.
In 48 hours, he reached 175 miles and climbed into 7th place. He was 3 miles ahead of his training partner, George Connor, who was half his age. He needed to reach 475 miles in order to share in the winnings. Some of his friends from New York City planned to award him a nice purse of money if he succeeded.
Campana made a speech about every 3 hours. It was the same in every case, and was to the effect that he has defeated 17 champions and would whip a few more before the race closed.
He climbed into 6th place after the 4th day with 335 miles. On the 5th day, Campana quit, a rarity for him, after 375 miles. His feet were so sore he could no longer walk on them. Frank Hart won with 475 miles. Campana stayed in the Midwest and made his way to St. Louis, Missouri for a 6-day race at the end of 1890, held over the Christmas holiday. 14 runners began on a small track 17 laps to the mile. It was the first time for those in St. Louis to witness Campana, and the following exaggeration was published to introduce him.
No walking race would be complete without Old Sport Campana. He has been competing in 6-day contests since they came into existence and has never been known to remain out of a race.
The race was held in Clark's Natatorium, one of the most popular places in the city. It featured a 5,600 square foot open-air swimming pool surrounded by spectator seating. It was used for swimming lessons, swimming races, and eventually 6-day foot races. During the winters, the natatorium needed to be used for other attractions like bicycle and running races. This was the first 6-day race held in that building and established the natatorium as the center place for 6-day races during the 1890s. Campana quickly made a good impression on the crowd.
He was cheered when he completed his first mile, and after it was completed, he entered upon his usual clownish tricks to the amusement of the assembled multitude. He is carrying less weight than any of the other contestants, as there is little but skin and bones to the old man. He is not even burdened with any hair. The old campaigner presented a strange sight as he galloped around the ring. His features are thin and prominent, and he has been eating constantly ever since the walk commenced, and the old man has been talking as constantly as he has been eating. His face is a study as he eats, talks, and walks all at the same time. Every once in a while, he breaks into a run, and then the crowd cheers him lustily.
By the 2nd day, Campana was doing remarkably well, in 4th place with 155 miles, less than 20 miles from the lead.
The old man took of his walking shoes and trotted around the sawdust ring in his socks, and then pulled those off and tried going in his bare feet. His occasional spurts never failed to bring forth applause from the audience. If he should hold out and secure a place, it will break the bookmakers, for tremendously long odds have been laid against him doing so.
On Christmas Day, 1890, curious spectators came out to watch Campana.
He appeared in a new costume, and the old man showed no signs of weakening. He was a great favorite with the audience, who frequently showered change at him. He was in a dog trot half the time, but when he lapsed into a walk, his gait was slow.
On the 5th day, Campana continued to walk hard in 5th place. He was at a serious disadvantage compared to the other runners.
The old man had no trainer and not even a tent in which to sleep. Some boys had fun with him and gave him a little more beer than he should have taken in his exhausted condition. Sport became even more talkative than usual and, in every lap, would make several stops to talk to the crowd. He also sang his celebrated song about Sullivan. His work is really phenomenal for a man of 62 years of age.
He was actually 54 years old. Campana reached a very respectable 450 miles in 5th place. He finished his race with several hours to go and then spent the rest of his time entertaining the crowd. He failed to make the required 500 miles to share in the gate receipts, but on the last day, he was the freshest man on the track and did not appear to be exhausted. About 17,000 people watched the race during the week. The race was a financial success, but Campana did not receive any money from the race.
He probably got more money thrown to him by the crowd than any of the contestants. If he had not gotten drunk, the old man would undoubtedly have done much better. He sent $175 home to his wife, Jenny, at Bridgeport, Connecticut, as a Christmas gift, and it is believed that he had about $500 thrown to him by the people.
There was no long rest for Campana. He quickly made his way to Minnesota for the next 6-day race to be held just 4 weeks later. Minneapolis became a hotbed for pedestrianism and would put on at least 5 6-day races in the coming years. Campana made a deep impression on the city. Several prominent runners, including Frank Hart, Norman Taylor, and Gus Guillermo, would make the city their new home. The race was scheduled for the large Washington rink. It was thought to be the largest skating rink in America at the time, but recently had not been used much except for political speeches. A couple weeks before the event, carpenters began transformation of the rink into a pedestrian arena.
The clang of carpenters' hammers and the nerve-tearing screeching of a dozen workmen's saws have set the old building's heart to throbbing again, and for a week anyway, the good old days will be restored.
Campana made his training headquarters in nearby St. Paul until the rink was ready to run in. A long article about Campana was published in the Minneapolis Daily Times.
Campana has long been the clown of the sawdust track and is known to every professional pedestrian the world over. He claims to be 62 years old and looks the part. He is quite a singer and great talker.
He claimed that he had walked to Minnesota all the way from Chicago and strongly denied arriving on the fast freight train.
For the last 15 years, Campana has been a funny card in 6-day matches. He was the circus end of the walks contested at Madison Square Garden. He is a little, comical-looking man with a deep valley in his face under his cheekbones, and a big chin and nose so near each other that Mr. Campana is in danger of having them singed if he smokes a cigar more than halfway down. He wears 4-days-old whiskers and is a plain dresser. He might be 35 years old, or 50, or 60. He says he was born 62 years ago.
Campana was interviewed at a downtown restaurant and had no problem talking about himself.
I'm a dead game sport and wouldn't sell my reputation for $50,000. Why, they talk about me in Egypt. I have made 75,000 miles in 30 years.
He showed the reporters all the tattoos on his body, including the name of his wife, Jenny Dalton Campana.
She is my wife. I think a good deal of her. She used to train me in my big matches. I am poor and respectable. I am a hustler from Hustlerville, and if I didn't make so much noise about myself, you would never hear of me.
On the day before the race, all the runners were resting except for Campana, who continued to shatter the atmosphere with his arms and tell everybody he chanced to meet that he had been acquainted with every man with a drop of sporting blood in his veins since the days of Yankee Sullivan.
The race began with 23 starters.
Old Sport was given volley after volley of enthusiastic outbursts when he appeared attired in a snow-white uniform. Across his chest in blue letters appeared the name, Old Sport. Campana, with his head on one side and a wrinkle in his legs, struggled manfully along near the rear and was cheered by the crowd. He talked to everyone, roasted his attendants, and pleased the crowd fully.
14 runners reached at least 100 miles during the first 24 hours, including Campana. He received a telegram from President Benjamin Harrison that read, "Make 500 miles and I will give you a lifelong job in the lighthouse in Chicago." He also received a telegram from his hero boxer, John L. Sullivan, who wrote, "Make 500 miles and I will give you $500 and pay your travel expenses back to Boston." Campana read that telegram from a chair in the center of the rink and received huge applause. On the third evening, Campana was one of the center of attractions.
One of the features was the singing of a song by Old Sport Campana, who caught the audience just right. The old-timer seemed pretty fresh and followed up his song by making a spurt.
As the race neared its conclusion, it was written,
Old Sport Campana was on the track more than any man in the race. He made lots of sport for the spectators yesterday. He gathered in a pocketful of silver dollars too. 3 admirers gave him $10 each, while several gave him $50. He certainly is a character. Those who have ever seen him will never forget him. He is alone worth the price of admission.
On the closing night, he climbed up on the judge's stand and sang a song about Sullivan. He received applause for 5 minutes, and the race manager gave him $20 of gold. At the finish, Campana reached 405 miles in 6th place.
As the men left the track at the finish, each was honored with a rousing cheer. Then they were called upon the press stand, each in turn introduced to the audience. Then handsome bouquets were presented to them all, and each ran around the track with his floral display while the orchestra played a national air appropriate to their nativity or parentage.
There was no rest for the weary. Many other runners, including Campana, went to St. Paul and started a 6-day, 12 hours per day race held just 2 weeks later in Lowry Arcade. The audience eagerly awaited Campana's performance and self-aggrandizing pronouncements.
Some people may have imagined that yesterday's windstorm was the result of atmospheric disturbances. Not so. It was all attributable to the fact that on the morning train, Old Sport Campana blew in to take his place on the sawdust track at the arcade in the 6-day race. With a wild whoop, as he passed out of the Union Depot doors, Old Sport declared that he was a sure winner of the race. Some of these ducks think I'm not in it. I'll show Drem that sport is on deck, yes. I'll bet any part of a $1,000 that I'm as good as third at the finish.
The race began on February 24th, 1891. Campana did well on the first 12-hour day, reaching 60 miles in 8th place.
Campana, in whose attenuated frame there lies concealed more of the vigor of youth than would seem possible, kept going in his peculiar gait, a cross between that of a lame dog and a strong-halt mule, but got over the ground surprisingly. His method of locomotion is entirely the reverse of graceful. It is quite the fad for visitors to throw their loose change at Old Sport and then see him make a lively lap or two. He jogs along nicely but finds time to stop now and then and do a jig for the delectation of the visitors.
Campana finished with 323 miles in 6th place. The race management admitted that he was paid a salary. A month later, in April 1891, it was reported that Campana was peddling chewing gum around sporting resorts in Chicago, Illinois. Gum was becoming more and more popular. False reporting stated that Campana had been greatly failing and was, quote, a wreck of his former self. Chicago didn't understand that he always went back to pedaling once his race season was over and always looked like a wreck. They were so certain that after 48 career ultra-distance races, he would never be seen on the track again. The sad news of his false downfall went all over the country, including back to his hometown in Connecticut. But in May 1891, C.J. Stevens was hired by the Chicago Herald to walk 500 miles from Chicago to Omaha, Nebraska in 9 days to advertise the newspaper. He was promised $1,000 if he succeeded. Another company, a wet goods house in Chicago, got into the game and sponsored Campana to beat Stevens. The plan was to walk on the railroad tracks the entire way. The first 75 miles was accomplished in 19 hours.
Stevens tried to get away from Campana, but the elderly person had a watch placed in his room, and whenever his younger foeman tried to get away in the night, he found a tottering shadow following him. After 2 days, Campana was close on the heels of Stevens, who was doing some tall hustling to hold his own with the time-worn pedestrian.
Stevens kept Campana in sight until mile 77, when Old Sport pressed far ahead.
Shortly after 9 a.m. on May 19, 1891, a slender, wire-built, elderly man, with black tights and a red cap, hurried off the Council Bluffs Bridge, and followed by a crowd of spectators, made for a saloon.
Campana completed the 500-mile journey in 8 days and 22 hours.
Old Sport, when he arrived, he was tolerably well pickled in whiskey, which he had drunk to keep him up on the way. He drank an enormous amount and attributes his success to that factor largely.
Stevens had stumbled on a railroad trestle in Iowa, spraining an ankle, and had to give up the race. He came in by train. Campana certainly convinced the public that the reports that he was a wrecked man were false. This was one of the most famous accomplishments of his running career. However, Stevens claimed that Campana cheated.
He had not held to the railroad track, but had taken shortcuts along wagon roads and turnpikes and was riding whenever he had an opportunity.
Campana declared that he followed the line of the Chicago and Northwestern train tracks right through, despite the assertions of Stevens and his trainer, Pendergast, to the contrary.
Stay tuned for more about Old Sport Campana and get my Old Sport Campana book on Amazon. With that, this is Davy Crockett, and this is the Ultra Running History Podcast. I hope you run fast and far, enjoy life, get outdoors, and most of all, stay safe and don't take unnecessary chances.